Could Myanmar's military stage another coup? The streets are tense as army chiefs downplay comments about scrapping the constitution. So how much power do they still hold a decade into Myanmar's transition to democracy? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Members of Myanmar's new parliament are about to take their seats for the first time. Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy won a landslide for a second time in last November's election. The military has since discredited the result, making unfounded allegations of voting fraud. A top general has suggested abolishing the constitution if it isn't followed. The UN and several nations have warned against a coup. The army now says the comments were taken out of context and insists soldiers will abide by the law. But this hasn't calmed fears of an attempted power grab, as Ali Fowl reports from Yangon.
Tension on the streets of Myanmar this week as the country braces for a possible political crisis.
We're not saying the military will take power, but we're not saying it won't either.
This was the moment that it all began. In a press conference on Tuesday, military spokesperson Zaw Min Tun refused to rule out the possibility of a coup. The following day, military chief Min Aung Hlaing stoked fears when he said the constitution should be repealed if it was not abided by. The comments follow weeks of complaints from the military of voter fraud in November's election and demands for an investigation. Fear escalated after reports of an increasing security presence and sightings of armoured vehicles being moved around various cities. As tensions reached their peak on Saturday, the military issued a new statement saying the commander-in-chief's comments had been misinterpreted. But just hours later, emboldened by rumours, hundreds of protesters gathered in Yangon at a pro-military rally where speeches welcomed a coup with support of the people.
Protests like this have been happening on an almost daily basis over the last few weeks. While they have been gaining attention, they've failed to draw the numbers for what would be considered a show of popular support. But this crowd is gaining confidence, and it's stoking fear in the community.
As the pressure builds, there have been violent attacks on NLD supporters watching on. The NLD say accusations of voter fraud are just being used as an excuse to sow fear.
Senior General Min Aung Hlaing is making the NLD scared and making the people scared. His main intention is to extend his senior general position.
Military Chief Min Aung Hlaing is due to retire in July and may be fearful of losing power. Although imminent action from the military now appears less likely, tension remains high as relations between the civilian government and the military reach an all-time low. Ali Fowl, Al Jazeera, Yangon.
The military ruled Myanmar for nearly 50 years until 2011, when it handed power to a nominally civilian government. But the army still controls the Defense, Interior and Borders ministries and is given a quarter of the seats in parliament. In 2015, Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy won enough seats to form a government. She became state councillor a year later, equivalent to a prime minister. Suu Kyi has been criticized for failing to condemn the military crackdown on Muslim Rohingyas and other minority groups. Last year, army generals rejected constitutional changes to further reduce their power. All right, let's bring in our guests. In Yangon, Min Zaw U, Executive Director of the Myanmar Institute for Peace and Security. In Bangkok, Phil Robertson is Deputy Asia Director at Human Rights Watch. Also in Yangon, Dunant, Managing Editor at Frontier Myanmar. Welcome to the program. Min, let me start with you today. Why these mixed messages from the military in Myanmar, and how tense does the situation remain there?
The military was upset that they are concerned, some of the points they raised about the irregularities, what they accuse, were ignored by the government and the UEC. And the UEC also refused to release those voting records. And the military tried to attain some of those records by its own means and pointed out some of the irregularities. So we don't know how these data actually represent the accuracy because UEC itself refused to release those data. So the tension was really high in recent week. And as far as I was informed that one of the senior minister from the government and the military were negotiating last 2 days. However, since yesterday, negotiations ceased without proper outcome. And tomorrow, there will be the first, the convention of the parliament, the convening of the parliament for the first time. And we are concerned that that could trigger some action from the military.
Phil, from your vantage point, after this latest statement from the military, where they seem to take a step back from the earlier statement, does the possibility of a coup in Myanmar seem less likely?
Well, it may seem less likely, but there shouldn't be any uncertainty about this. I mean, the Burmese military should absolutely state that they will not engage in a military coup, and they should stop their intimidation of the civilian government. They have certainly the right to raise issues, and there is now a proceeding at the Supreme Court to consider some of these issues about allegations of electoral fraud. But it's important to recognize that no evidence has really been brought forward by the pro-military USDP and another small party that filed that complaint. We don't actually know the sort of full content of the complaints that they're alleging, just that they're saying there may be as many as over 8 million irregularities. So, I mean, without evidence, to engage in this sort of war of words and, real saber rattling that the military has done with, sending armored vehicles onto the streets, it's outrageous and it's unacceptable.
Ben, I want to take a step back for a moment and look at the issue of a transition to democracy in Myanmar. We hear a lot about this, but broadly speaking, how has this transition actually been going there?
The transition to democracy, as it's often called, I mean, it stops well short of full democracy. Under the constitution that the military itself wrote when it was ruling the country, does hand the military a quarter of parliamentary seats, which in turn allows it to veto all changes to the constitution. It also allows it to control several very important ministries that control the police and a lot of the internal administration. So in a very obvious way, it's an incomplete transition. However, Aung San Suu Kyi's strategy for the last few years has been not to antagonize the military. She's avoided commenting on their conduct during the various internal wars. And there was a hope that, through a less confrontational approach, she could win the military over and get them to agree to changing the constitution. However, that strategy has not worked. And, we're seeing very strong evidence of that now, where relations between her and military chief have been very poor for the last few years, and they seem to have really come to a head now.
Min, does it look to you like these pro-military demonstrations will be growing in the days and weeks ahead?
Well, these demonstrations were there, but on the other hand, these people were cracked down. Very recently, one of the leaders of the pro-military demonstrator were arrested when the police raided his house. And those protests around Naypyidaw were also cracked down. So what we can say is the police are acting on them and arresting some of those members. But our concern is those, the pro-military protesters and other pro-government protesters, if they come out to the streets, could go head-to-head, and that could trigger instability at the time of actual military coup, or if the military try to add something to prevent the parliament from convening the first section.
Phil, Myanmar's military has been coming under increased pressure from international bodies because of the atrocities committed against the Rohingya in 2017. You know, there's this case in the International Court of Justice alleging that a genocide was perpetrated against the Rohingya. Rights groups have been urging businesses around the world to cut ties with Myanmar's military. I'm just curious about, in this kind of climate, when military generals have been sanctioned in the past and where there is this momentum that is building to try to hold Myanmar's military to account because of what happened, would a coup have backfired?
Well, if there was a coup, I think you would see a new round of sanctions coming against Myanmar and against whatever government replaced the elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD. I would expect that there would be increased isolation for Myanmar and, really a return to the previous days when you had a purely military government, which was a pariah state. It's very clear that that would be the reaction of the international community. And I think it's worth noting that as soon as it became clear that there was basically threats being made for a military takeover, you had a very strong reaction by over 15 Western embassies putting out a joint statement, and a statement by the spokesperson of the UN Secretary General, in both cases calling for the election results to be respected and for the law to be upheld. So there's no appetite in the international community to sort of be soft on any sort of games being played by the military here. Certainly there would be, I think, a very, very strong international reaction and a very well-deserved reaction if, Min Aung Hlaing and the military decide to try to take over.
Ben, reports emerged last week that President Joe Biden's administration in the United States was going to be reviewing what had happened in Rakhine State and perhaps making a determination about if they perceived what happened to have been a genocide. Is this something that is currently worrying generals in Myanmar?
I imagine that it is. I mean, I think when the military did launch its crackdown in northern Rakhine State in late 2017, I think they probably didn't expect that there would be a case at the International Court of Justice, as there has been, in which the country has been represented by Aung San Suu Kyi. However, I imagine that they are banking on the fact that in the US's overall approach to the country will be informed by a broader desire to counter China. That does seem to be driving a lot of US policy in this part of the world, and any desire to strategically counter China would most likely involve, sort of maintaining fairly strong relationships with the governments of Southeast Asia, because Southeast Asia is really at the front line of this geopolitical rivalry. So they're probably banking on that as a reassurance.
Thanks, Ben. Min, is this the most direct confrontation yet between the civilian government and the military in Myanmar? And how do you see this playing out going forward?
Well, this confrontation is likely to move forward because it appears that the negotiation has been stopped, and the government will go ahead with the parliamentary convention, and then the military may boycott or add something. And that if that continue and leading to a military coup, then the military may act accordingly with the 2008 Constitution, which only allows the military to hold onto power for 2 6-month extension. So that is a 1-year maximum they could hold on to power. After that, they will have to hold the election and return the power to the civilian government if there's any coup. So that's the main point. The military was sending message that, okay, we act accordingly with the 2008 Constitution, not the extra constitutional coup. So that means like they will not abolish the 2008 constitution. They will do so with the 2008 constitution. However, the coup will devastate the current development and the political transition in Myanmar. It could be a very dark moment for the country as well.
Phil, I saw you nodding to some of what Min was saying just then. Did you want to jump in?
Well, I do think that it would be a disaster for Myanmar if there was a coup. All the progress that's been made, moving towards, a more democratic system there. There are still obviously major problems that do exist with the existing elections. I mean, obviously the Rohingya were disenfranchised. There's many election areas that didn't have elections because of security issues. There's a whole problem of the 2008 Constitution, which is an undemocratic constitution, written by the military for the military in some ways. So I think that it would be foolish for the military to take this dispute and then take it to the extent that they would commit a coup. But we don't know. I mean, the Myanmar military has done very stupid things in the past, and we can't know what they're actually thinking.
Ben, if you could, I'd like to ask you to expand a little bit on what Phil was talking about there, because in November's elections, voting was canceled in large parts of conflict-hit states, including Rakhine and Kachin. Minorities like the Rohingya were not allowed to vote. This has really made observers question the credibility of the election, right?
Yes, true. And, in the military's attempts to discredit the outcome of the election, they do have some ammunition to work with. And the fact that the Electoral Commission is not an independent institution, it is wholly appointed by the president, so therefore by the ruling party. Its decisions cannot be reviewed by an independent court or by the parliament. So all this kind of adds sort of fuel to the controversy. However, I think it's important to state that there were several independent observer groups that were observing the election, such as the US-based Carter Center, the Asian Network for Free Elections, for instance, and they all broadly concluded that although there were some procedural problems and the election was not inclusive, it did exclude large numbers of people, it was a credible outcome, and that the NLD's political mandate to rule is very robust, and I think it's good to point out these flaws, but there have been sort of no observer groups that have really called the fundamental credibility of the election into question.
Min, the fact that the military chief is set to retire fairly soon, is that setting off a power grab amongst Army generals? I mean, is that playing into this at all?
I don't think that's a critical matter, because if the military decide to extend it itself, the government cannot prevent the military from doing so. Because according to the current constitution, the military council, which is composed of the military top generals, can make their own decision who will be the commander-in-chief. They can extend the tenure of the commander-in-chief, even though that was set by up to 65 years. That was the one who set up, the current commander-in-chief was the one who set up that, who suggested that 65 years. So if he wants to change it, they can change it. Or they may even have a different structure, making the commander-in-chief some sort of like a counselor of the military or some kind of supreme positions. So the government can do very little or none about how the military will have their own leadership. So that is not necessarily the big issue in this current crisis.
Phil, you often hear that the civilian government doesn't have as much power as the military does in Myanmar. I just want to try to clarify this. I mean, what does the power sharing deal there look like, and how fragile is it?
Well, I mean, I've never really bought that there's not that a strong civilian government, because this civilian government in the NLD has had an absolute majority to pass almost any laws it wants. It had that from the 2015 election onwards, and it's going to have even a larger majority in the incoming parliament. So it has the entire lawmaking power. It just hasn't used it that much, to be honest. I mean, I think that with a dominant majority like that, I'm surprised that they haven't pushed a lot further. But there is the ongoing issue that when you talk about implementing something, particularly when you're dealing with, for instance, a Ministry of Home Affairs, which is controlled by the military and is actually set out in the Constitution that there has to be a serving military officer as the minister, you run into problems because things that are ordered from Naypyidaw don't get done on the ground. And this is the big challenge, that you have a sort of a two-headed government here, with a military having its own power through these ministries, and the NLD having the power of the people through the election. And somehow this needs to be resolved in a way that the two sides can work together to promote development and human rights in the country.
Ben, if we're talking about the civilian government, let me ask you, how much support does Aung San Suu Kyi currently have in Myanmar?
She has tremendous support, and she was really front and center of the ruling party's election campaign. And not only in the election, which was sort of largely seen as an endorsement of her rule, during the entire COVID-19 crisis. She's been giving incredibly regular speeches, that have been broadcast on social media, and they get a huge amount of positive engagement. And another thing to say is that her representation of the country at the Rohingya genocide trial at the ICJ was, obviously criticized a huge amount internationally, but here in the country, that was a hugely popular move. There were pretty big rallies in the big city. People were saying, we stand with Mother Sue. So really her authority and her appeal has only grown in the last few years. And to a large extent, you could say that the ruling party is the Aung San Suu Kyi party.
Min, when the new parliament is seated on Monday, will army generals be losing more of their power?
Well, not necessarily. The military already have this 25%, and some of the management of the security institutions in Myanmar. So they were not necessarily losing more power. That is not what the NLD government is threatening at all. But however, the current tension between the military and civilian government, if we're not resolved, it will have a significant impact on the governance of the country. The first, the military may even withhold its participation in the parliament. And if the military refuses to cooperate with the government will not be able to move forward with the current ongoing peace process with this 21 plus armed groups, which government consider one of the priorities in the next 5 years. So if the military doesn't cooperate, the government will have a very bad time, very hard time to continue with the peace negotiations. So there will be a lot of other consequences on the governance and also peace process and the other issues related to the security. So now the military doesn't even mobilize, try to avoid direct confrontation with the armed groups, and now the armed groups are moving into some of those areas and extort and also kidnap, and the military was just sitting and just looking at them without acting it. So we may see some sort of a security deteriorations in coming months if the government and the military fail to reach any sort of agreement.
All right, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all our guests, Min Zaw-u, Phil Robertson, and Ben Dunant. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.